Thank you, Susan, for that, and thank you everyone for attending this session, both in the conference hall and at home. So we've heard some really inspiring stories about growth and ambition in primarily urban creative industry clusters, particularly here in Belfast. And let's face it, also about significant investment. But actually, I think we'll hear that creative industries are sort of scattered the length and breadth of the United Kingdom. And we're going to have a discussion about really what that means, what it looks like, what obstacles those creative industry businesses face, and to start thinking about what we can do to support them and their ambitions to grow. So I'm really delighted to have with me two people who actually come from either ends of the UK mainland. So we've got Karen Cross, who is head of strategic management of fashion management and tourism and events, and also hospitality, which is a lot to cover, at Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen. And also Emily Sorrell. And Emily, I think you would refer to yourself as a peddler of innovation in the heritage industry in Cornwall. And also, very aptly for this discussion, we have Josh Siepel, who's at the University of Sussex Business School, and also a lead researcher at Nesta's Policy and Evidence Centre. So we're going to try and paint a picture, really, of what creative industries look like outside of urban centres. So Josh, we're going to start with you. Nice to see you. Josh, so tell us a little bit about, you've done a lot of research, really, in the last couple of years or so, about the characteristics of various clusters, and recently the characteristics of microclusters. Can you tell us a little bit about what that tells us?
Sure, and first off, thanks so much for having me, and I wish I could be with you. It looks absolutely fantastic and sounds absolutely great, and hope you're all having a great time. So what we've been doing in our research at the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre is trying to really understand what's going on with creative clusters. And for a long time, the assumption was that creative clusters happened in big cities, in the Londons, the Manchesters, the Leedses, the Edinburghs, the Brightons, the bigger places. And one of the things that we did in our Creative Nation piece of research last year was to identify that actually underlying this perception of large clusters, there are actually a number of small creative, what we call microclusters. And we identified 709 discrete microclusters all the way across the UK. And the really interesting thing is that we found that microclusters outside of these large, established, famous clusters that we already know, these clusters, companies in these clusters, they were more likely to want to grow, they were more likely to, they acted like companies in the big clusters. And that's something that's really interesting. And so one of the things that we're currently working on now is trying to understand specifically in the context of rural microclusters. We identified a decent number of rural microclusters in our research. And we're trying to understand now whether rural microclusters have all of these same characteristics or not. And initial evidence appears to suggest that in a number of ways that they do. And so this is something which is really interesting, suggesting that actually even much smaller groupings of clusters, so we identify microclusters as being 50 organizations within sort of a relative geographical radius, that within even kind of 50 or sometimes possibly even smaller groups across a rural area, there are some of the benefits of being in a larger cluster.
So Josh, as well, you've also considered companies that are outside clusters altogether. They're not then, they could be on top of a mountain or on the beach. So what kind of have you sort of learned much about them through your research? Or is that harder?
No, we've looked at those as well. And what we have found is we've found that there appear to be some of the benefits of microclustering are substantial. There appear to be benefits to microclustering compared to companies that are further afield outside of some of those areas. But we do see some interesting things where actually there aren't that many differences. I think one of the things that we have identified from our research is that one of the things which really appears to drive a lot of the clustering behaviors and innovation behaviors and things like this is actually things like company size and the sector that a company is in. So it's actually sometimes, yes, the rural factors or being remote are important, but a lot of things are, is a company big enough to be able to meet demand? Are they able to, do they have the desire to grow? Do they have the resources to grow? And one of the things that we've come upon again and again is the need for appropriate resources for companies in these areas, because they may not necessarily be getting them.
So thanks, Josh. So Josh has really painted a picture of what the data sort of tells us. But Karen, what does that look like in your region, away from the sort of central belt of Scotland?
Yeah, so a lot of the projects that I work on deal with Highlands and Islands. So looking at creative businesses in Harris, in Shetland, in Orkney. And the challenge is that they have, Josh in his reports talks about proximity, and there were microclusters that you had identified, Josh, I think in Shetland and Orkney, but not on Lewis and Harris, but they have extra challenges to overcome. If they want to attend a conference like this, they've got an extra flight to do to get to the mainland to then go somewhere else. And for many of these very small businesses, it's thinking about the cost benefit, the cost financially, but also the cost in terms of their time. That's time that they're taking out to go somewhere. And research we were doing with some of them last year identified that the COVID lockdown had actually brought benefits because there were more online opportunities for them to attend that had replaced physical face-to-face events. And for them, this was a great benefit. They could go to a virtual trade fair now. They could attend a training webinar. And they were really seeing that as a benefit, and it was opening up a new world for them.
So I think we're going to pick up a little bit later about, whether the pandemic actually has provided opportunities for these kind of businesses. So Emily, what does it sort of look like in Cornwall? What's the landscape of creative industry SMEs in Cornwall?
I suppose the most important thing to say about Cornwall is that there is a huge freelance economy, which does make it quite difficult to talk accurately about what's actually going on, partially because freelancers are sort of working under the surface, but also because there's a real culture of people doing more than one thing at once, either through kind of economic necessity or just because it's the sort of culture of things people tend to have fingers in lots of pies, so to speak. So we're through the research that I've been doing through the Creative and Cultural Leadership Development Programme in Cornwall, I've sort of partnered with two other women, Hannah Irwin and Bethany Line, to uncover some of that a bit more and try and work out what's actually going on within networks in Cornwall more broadly, and see if we can sort of dig beneath the surface and see what types of networks there are, and try and articulate some of the value of those within the freelance economy specifically, because that will be really important, I think, moving forwards.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that. So both of you are involved in creating networks or looking at networks. So Karen, you recently started a project for Immersive Scotland Research Network. So tell us a little bit about that and what the motivation was to sort of get that going, and kind of some of the things that you're doing to try and make that work.
Sure. The Immersive Scotland network grew organically, again, due to the COVID lockdown. It grew out of another project that I'm working on called Augmented Fashion. And we were really struggling to find immersive tech companies in Scotland and research people as well who could work with us on immersive. And eventually we found someone down in Glasgow, which is quite far away from Aberdeen. And then he said, well, have you talked to so-and-so at Glasgow University? So we went and talked to them. And they said, oh, have you spoke to so-and-so in Edinburgh? And And before we knew it, we had this list of around 60 people, and we'd had a few Zoom meetings, and we thought, we actually need to do something with this. Something needs to come out of it. So we put together a proposal and managed to get some funding, and the Immersive Scotland it's a networking grant, so we're trying to formalise something so that we're not duplicating effort, so that we know what's going on in all these different places. We can start to share that knowledge and push things on faster and further, rather than being in separate little clusters, not really knowing what's happening and probably repeating the same things over and over. So we've had our first, unfortunately, virtual meeting due to COVID, but next week we've got face-to-face meetings down in Edinburgh. We've got a workshop day, and we're really excited to actually meet in person. I think there's going to be about 30 of us there, really get a good handle on some of the exciting developments that are happening across Scotland in Immersive, and thinking about what the next steps could be in terms of building on that.
We've talked quite a lot yesterday, particularly about these huge kind of studio installations around immersive and virtual productions, but you've got a solution that you have in mind in terms of just enabling people to sort of touch and feel and experiment with immersive, which is rather different in scale and
yeah, so we've got our mobile art van. And it's kitted out with Oculus headsets and easily movable display units with tablets, and a really enthusiastic guy who drives it around and knows how to use all the tech. So that will, as part of the Immersive Scotland network, that will be going on tour and taking the tech out to rural places, rural communities, practitioners, school kids, so business and the next generation, to put that tech in front of them and show them the possibilities and show them that it doesn't have to be scary, and get them interested in it.
Give people a chance to sort of get on that first rung. And
absolutely, because I think a lot of the things that we looked at yesterday are quite high level, but there are a lot of small businesses out there that are really at the bottom rung of that digital experience, and it's about taking them up gradually.
And they're not going to get here.
No, and they don't need to. They don't need to, but they are entering a crowded online marketplace, a lot of them now, again, post-COVID and losing face-to-face business. So it is about thinking about ways to empower them to stand out online in that global marketplace and make their mark.
So Emily, as well, when you looked at networks in Cornwall, the work that you've been doing looking at them, there was quite a distinction you felt between organic networks that were sort of growing up of their own volition and naturally, but also synthetic networks. And a lot of what we've talked about, here, and what we do talk about are about interventions and sort of trying to sort of create them quite synthetically. What do you sort of feel about that in the context of your region?
So in Cornwall specifically, and I imagine everywhere within the creative industries, there is a much more fluid boundary between professional networks and personal networks. And that's why we felt it was really important to begin to unpack this idea of organic networks and synthetic networks, and really to articulate the sort of difference between them. So an organic network being a more sort of circumstantial network, with sort of a social focus, I suppose, whereas these synthetic networks are much more curated. They're usually kind of assessed and analysed. They have a set boundary, and also a professional focus. So as you said, when funders or policymakers are talking about building or promoting networks, they are talking about these synthetic networks. And what is really important to us to articulate, especially within the rural economy, is that what we're trying to get to through those synthetic networks, we're actually trying to form organic networks from that. Those are the things that will live on and continue to give value even after funding has run out, even after there are no facilitators left. And that's often the question with networks is, the funding's up, what's next? And it's just, articulating that those things will continue to live on and thrive. And I think there's quite an interesting shift in perspective in terms of how we then talk about facilitating those, that they're not meant to live forever, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So we talked a bit, and it sounds quite, I suppose when we're talking, it does sound a bit sort of cottagey, and I think that can give the wrong impression. So, turning to Josh, you found no lack of ambition. Your research tells you that not only is there, that there is real ambition. What is your research saying about growth in terms of microclusters outside urban clusters? Because I think they've actually been faring very well.
Yes, that's right. I think companies in microclusters prior to the pandemic, they were more likely to grow. They were also more likely to want to grow, and even beyond that, when we looked at the result of the pandemic, there was still a lot of appetite for growth, and indeed, relatively speaking, relatively good performance among companies in these microclusters. So I think in a lot of cases there is appetite to grow, and I think just to echo what Karen and Emily were saying there, I think the role of networks, I think the role of community is really important there, because I think it's not just necessarily there's being clustered, which is good, and being sort of co-located, but having knowledge sharing, having those types of bridges being built between different people and different communities and things in a local area. That's really, really important, and building and facilitating those. And particularly as Emily was saying about building those and kind of making those sustainable so that they go on and those relationships are created, that becomes really important, because once you start seeing growth, once you start having growth ambitions, and then people are sort of hooked in with those, that plays a really important role in helping to build up growth ambitions and building these communities that serve as the basis of clusters.
So Josh, do you see any difference in the kind of R&D activity between different kinds of clusters, between, urban microclusters and sort of more dispersed microclusters? Or is it the same?
Really interestingly, all of our analysis appears to suggest that participation in both innovation activities more broadly and R&D in particular appears to be more or less similar between urban clusters, microclusters outside of the big clusters, and then specifically in rural settings as well. And so we don't seem to see that much of a difference in participation in innovation activities, and even as far along down as looking at things like participation in R&D tax credits, which is kind of a hot issue at the moment. We don't tend to see that much of a difference between more rural and urban settings, particularly in microclusters. And I think, in a sense, that's good. It suggests that actually what we're seeing is that these companies in rural settings, they're like the ones in bigger areas. They have similar levels of participation, innovation. They have good ideas, and the challenge is resourcing them to make sure that they're able to achieve what they want to do, and they don't find themselves constrained on the basis, well, solely at least on resource.
So Karen, what do you think universities can do in terms of supporting that R&D in our kind of region, in your region? What's happened there?
Yeah, I think universities have a huge role to play, and I can only speak for my own one, but Robert Gordon has an enterprise and innovation group. It's been running for a few years now. It has a startup accelerator, so new businesses can pitch for that, and it supports 10 new businesses each year. Some of those have gone on to then attract larger, further funding and really establish themselves. We also have upskilling for creative industries, so we were lucky that the Scottish Funding Council gave us some money for that, and we were able to provide free digital upskilling, which was really popular during COVID, and we've just got some more funding to do more of that. We've had a creative industry specific kind of 6-week summer course that a lot of small creative businesses in Aberdeen, and pre-COVID that was face-to-face, and obviously COVID came along and we thought, oh, blimey, what are we going to do here? And we actually just really smoothly pivoted that to online, and it was great because we were able to then help people at a wider distance. So there's real positives that have come out of that. The other thing that we have is, and again it comes back to proximity that is in your report, Josh, is RG and a couple of other universities have our Orkney hub. So we have actually placed ourselves up in that rural location, because I think it's all very well for us to be, Aberdeen as a small city, but to be there and say, oh yeah, do that, and we think this, but to actually be up in that locality, to employ people that are there on the ground, that are local, that have that depth of understanding, and then collaborate with them, has given some really rich outputs and a better quality of support, I think.
Yeah. So you talked a bit there about the pandemic, and Josh, so you've also caught up with companies that you'd looked at pre-pandemic very recently, I think at the end of earlier this year. So how you've actually seen something very interesting about the differences in how companies have fared during the pandemic within urban clusters and with more dispersed microclusters, which is quite surprising actually. Can you tell us?
Yes, I mean, oh, sorry. I mean, one of the things that came out from that, which was really interesting for us, is that companies in microclusters outside of the big clusters, they were more likely to have added employees through the pandemic, but they were also more likely to do this by, and this kind of links back to what Karen was saying about some companies in more rural areas benefiting from moving online, is companies in the more remote microclusters, they benefited because they were able to increase their sales to more dispersed parts of the UK. So they were more likely to be selling, not necessarily in their own area, but to be selling across the UK or indeed exporting more. And so that's something which was a really interesting finding, that companies in these microclusters, they seem, I mean, obviously the effect of the pandemic has been very marked for the creative industries on aggregate, but certain parts of the creative industries, our report showed, seem to have done relatively well. And all things being equal, companies in the rural, more dispersed microcluster settings seem to have done potentially a bit better than some of their other businesses that might be relying more on just local business.
So Josh, I know this is hard because you don't like to speculate, but why do you think that might be? What's your guess?
I mean, one of the things that we know is that clusters in general tend to benefit from in larger clusters, there tends to be a lot of benefit from essentially local trade. So if you look at companies in London, lots of companies in London do a majority of their business with other companies in London. If you're talking about companies that are in more rural, more dispersed settings, the demand isn't necessarily there to the same extent. That means you can just go and get everything within, within zones 6 in London. If you actually have to be looking more further afield for your customer base, the shift to online may have been less pronounced, perhaps, and may have provided more opportunities. Now that everyone's online, some of those opportunities that might otherwise have been just within more of sort of a local scene are now might have opened up to people who previously might not have had a ticket to entry. And I mean, that's partially speculation, partially based on some of the initial evidence that we have from this. But I think there's something there which is really interesting. I think the shift to people being prepared to work remotely and being able and demand being more dispersed rather than being purely local may have benefited these businesses.
So that suggests that actually, what has been a disadvantage, we could argue, about being rural and dispersed is looking a bit more like an advantage post-pandemic. I mean, what do you feel about that? What have you seen? Do you think there are opportunities there? You've mentioned that some of the businesses that you work with have pivoted to digital for the very first time.
Yeah, I mean, on some of these island communities, for example, they rely on tourism trade. So when lockdown happened, that was 97% of their business gone. So it was a really steep learning curve for them to move from using social media as an occasional post of a pretty picture to actually clearly promoting and marketing their products. But the feedback that we got from some of them was that they saw increased interest from consumers, consumers looking perhaps for more traceability, more local heritage, more provenance. And I don't know if the pandemic somehow made us feel a little bit like we want to buy British, or we want to support our local communities, or we want something that feels really authentic and safe and natural, and all of that fits very much into a lot of Scottish design ethos. So I do wonder if that slightly changed consumer demand, and the fact that they were able to put themselves out there and reach more of these consumers remotely has just joined together to give that better opportunity.
And Emily, you've got a new design business. Do you feel like there's more opportunity? Do you feel that a window is opened that you can jump through?
It's difficult to say, to be honest. I am a fairly recent graduate, so I graduated from Falmouth University in 2019, and so had the sort of initial year of working out what to do with myself, and getting busy setting up a bunch of different projects and a kind of community networking platform in Cornwall, and then launching into my own practice working as an innovation designer within museums. And that was certainly an opportunity in that museums in particular were being forced to question how they could be more innovative. So it was useful. In that sense, some really positive things came out of the pandemic, just in willingness to take a risk. But in terms of the funding opportunities, that there was obviously less opportunity there. So it's been an interesting year.
So funding opportunities, yeah, really key. And so going to you, Josh, I think you found that, didn't you, in terms of obstacles to that ambition to grow, particularly for microclusters outside of urban centres. That was a real factor, wasn't it, came through?
Yes, definitely. And that's one of the things we found that really struck us, was that there's clear evidence that companies in microclusters, they want to grow, they have grown, they've got the ambition, but they don't always have access to the finance that they need. And it's a complicated issue. There's a need for more resources for these companies. At the same time, it's also an element of both encouraging demand for capital from businesses, saying actually growth capital is something you can achieve, something you should seek out if you want to. At the same time, also there's an interesting element of in terms of financial institutions and investors and things like that, also possibly in some cases bringing them along to say, actually, well, maybe not all of the action is in London and Manchester and Bristol and Brighton and Edinburgh and a couple of places. So there's interesting things that are going on there, and this is one of the things that the government invested in through the DCMS Creative Scale-Up program, where they were trying to build both demand and supply for capital for growing creative businesses in a number of regions. And it's one of the things that, in terms of our research, has really pointed to the importance of this. And I think particularly for more rural areas and for more rural businesses, having access to some of these resources are really, really important to allow them to achieve their ambitions.
Yeah, so what do you feel about that, Karen? Do you think, does your experience chime with that?
Yeah, I mean, all of the businesses that we work with in our research projects need more funding to be able to grow, and they do have that ambition to grow. They're based on a tiny island in off the coast of Scotland, and they're ambitious to sell their products in China, or to make their products more sustainable, or to develop an immersive experience that will enhance their brand. They're interested in all these things. But it is trying to find where those pots of money are, and then investing the time into these lengthy application processes, and then discovering there's one criteria that you don't quite meet, and you've just wasted all your time filling out that form. So it's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, and these are people who don't necessarily have the time and resources to jump through those hoops. And I guess again, that's where universities or cultural organisations, support organisations like Highlands and Islands Enterprise, that's where they can come in and perhaps help out to facilitate that, and finding out about these things as well. One of the projects that I've been working on that did have small amounts of funding to give out to creative businesses, we worked really, really hard to promote that. We wanted to make sure that as many of these small businesses as possible knew that this tiny pot of money was available. And actually the response we got was immense. It was overwhelming. And we then had to rush out and try and desperately get extra funding, because we couldn't possibly have let down the number of people. So it shows the desire is out there.
I think it's quite interesting that, and perhaps this is to do with a lack of kind of organised venture capital in our region, in Devon and Cornwall, that the two of the biggest kind of crowdfunding businesses are actually in Devon and Cornwall. So Crowdcube in Exeter, and Crowdfunder for a lot of social enterprises in Cornwall. So, doing it locally, globally kind of thing is really working. I think if businesses are it takes a lot of work to do crowdfunding. It's not an easy solution, but it is a way to go, isn't it?
There's a great business in the Highlands called Prickly Thistle Tart, and she crowdfunded to bring weaving back to that area of the Highlands where it had been completely lost. And she is an absolute sort of powerhouse of energy in terms of trying to realise that dream. And actually she has two key strands. One is sustainability, and she talks about how this business that she's trying to set up is labour intensive. It's not about industrialising, it's about providing meaningful employment and really respecting heritage and tradition. Her products are not traditional. They're really funky, they're really new, they're really contemporary. So she's bringing that old and new together. And that was done through crowdfunding, which was amazing.
So we've talked about finance, but one of the other major obstacles that everyone talked about so much yesterday and at the conference is about skills. Is so that and how important that is to growth, and that has particular challenges, I think, in sort of rural and semi-rural areas, doesn't it? And in terms of, I think, young people growing up in rural regions can be excluded from creative industries in the way that people with other barriers sometimes are, and that's sometimes forgotten, I think, because really and that's kind of, you have to see it to be it idea for young people. They're not seeing those jobs, they don't know what they are, so they don't sort of project themselves forward into those kind of roles. But the other thing is really about retaining graduates as well, isn't it, Emily?
Absolutely,
Which, is a major issue, I think. Certainly in Cornwall and in Devon, that's an issue, that we're not hanging on to these absolutely brilliant young people. But we've hung on to you. But tell us a little bit about, some of the challenges that people face there.
Yeah, so a few years ago, a bunch of stakeholders got together in Cornwall to talk about the issue of the brain drain, which is essentially mirrored in a lot of different rural contexts where young people are leaving to gain skills and higher education, at which point we in Cornwall gained a whole lot of EU funding to develop that. And we now have 3 excellent university campuses. We have, I think, 7 colleges, all targeted to very specific skills and innovation. There is still a major gap in terms of this, as we spoke about, what comes next. Once you graduate, there is very little support for people staying down in Cornwall and to build those skills, necessary skills to work within that rural context. So self-employment skills, networking skills, communication with clients further afield, as Josh mentioned, is really important. And if I could just echo what Karen was saying earlier about funding as well, just to, sorry to come back around, but I think within heritage funding particularly, it's been really interesting to see how the pandemic has changed that, because when things sort of initially blew up with all of the issues with the pandemic, there was a real move towards funding for immediate survival, and all of the funding opportunities for thinking about what comes next were kind of removed, and we're now seeing more of a re-emergence of those, which I think is really positive, just to, not so we didn't linger on anything too gloomy. But we are seeing now a really great move towards funders asking that question of how can we look back and also evolve at the same time, and to have this evolution, but also this revolution in terms of museums, and that's being applied everywhere else as well.
And of course, I think that in rural and semi-rural regions, creative industries are inextricably often tied up with visitor economy and with heritage as kind of the beneficiaries of creative tech and creative industry activity. And so the relationship is often very symbiotic, isn't it? Certainly is in Devon and Cornwall, and yeah. But we promised we wouldn't go down the rabbit hole of finding places to live either, which is an incredible challenge, isn't it? The pressure on housing, and as welcome as I'm really aware of some really big starry names returning to their where they were born and grew up in the West Country, and of course there'll be others as well that feel able to move because of the pandemic and remote working, but that also adds to some kind of pressure, doesn't it, for our sort of homegrown talents and our own educated talents.
Yeah, not to linger on it.
Not to linger on it.
But I think within that issue of the brain drain, it is obviously a huge issue at the moment. We can talk about how great Cornwall or Scotland or the rural economies are for graduates and for people who want to be self-starting until we're blue in the face. But if no one can find anywhere to live, then obviously that's a huge spanner in the works that does need to be talked about and addressed.
But we're not going to fix that today.
In another setting.
But let's talk a little bit about some of the interventions that we could consider to try and boost our creative industries in our regions. And so one of the things that we might have done, and did do, so 2 years ago, was invest in physical buildings and innovation centres and hubs, and we've seen that is continuing in a big scale in places like Belfast and whatever. But I think that has, for us, quite a big question mark over it in terms of whether that is value for money and whether something that we want to do. And particularly because in our region, natural capital is so important to us. So we talked about the visitor economy, but it is built often on natural capital, and thinking about net zero as well is really important. So do you have feelings about, I think it's a really hard one to answer actually, but do you have feelings about whether physical innovation centres are worth doing?
I think it's very challenging for Highlands and Islands for sure, because wherever you decide to put that hub, it's going to be really far away.
It's in the wrong place.
But yeah, it's only going to benefit, a few people. And again, coming back to these small creative industries, do they invest the time and the fuel costs to travel to a hub when actually they probably have a nice setup at home? Space isn't an issue for them as it would be for somebody in an inner city flat who would be, and also that experience, if you're in an inner city and you walk out and you go to your favourite cafe and you go to your hub and you go to the gym on the way home or whatever, that's not what happens in a rural place. You're driving from here, there, or going on a boat to get from one island to another. So I think there's there are questions around, and I guess coming out of COVID, questions around, can hubs be virtual? Can they be a hybrid? Is there a place that they go sometimes? I certainly, some of the small businesses that we talked to in a recovery workshop that we did, they were talking about the mental health implications of working at home and the blurring of boundaries between work and home life, and missing where they did have a studio to go to, missing just bouncing ideas off of people on a casual day-to-day basis. So I think there is a place for places for people to go, but big hubs are not going to work up around these areas. I don't know what you think, Emily.
There are hubs in Cornwall, aren't there?
Yes.
That are pretty successful, I would say.
And a number in development as well. Hub seems to be a real buzzword at the moment. And I think what is important to recognise, to totally echo what Karen said, is that you're investing in people, not a shell of a building. And it's that underlying culture of collaboration and connection that you need to also be fostering. A real barrier to networking that we've kind of identified through this research that we've been doing is GDPR and people's perceptions of GDPR. And the problem with hubs specifically that are tethered either to a physical space or to a more corporate organization, normally, funders or someone who's facilitating it, the issue with those is that they are bound by compliance. And so people are often reluctant to make those connections, and people are kind of more wary of that than they might be in a more informal kind of community setting. And so there is a culture of sort of going through this central nucleus to connect with each other. So the whole question around hubs and whether they can be effective, I think, is completely tied in with how much you can foster those synthetic and then organic networks within that setting, and whether there's a better kind of structure and culture that you can foster around them.
Yeah. So absolutely, it's still more about connecting the people and where they are. Yeah.
I think also there's something around looking at what we already have.
Definitely.
So perhaps looking at libraries that exist and how used they are and what spaces they have available, and what tech we could perhaps put into those. Community halls, there's a great network of community halls across Highlands and Islands that haven't been used much during COVID, and to bring those back to life and think of how we could utilise these. I think there's an interesting piece of work there.
And that's an excellent model as well. And we have Carnter Cove in Cornwall, which uses village halls to bring sort of theatre and arts and film specifically to different rural organisations, and Nudge in Plymouth, which uses disused buildings on Union Street.
And Josh, do you have a feeling about the physical versus virtual and the power of either in terms of, fostering growth in creative industries?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think both what both Emily and Karen have said is really interesting. It sort of points to the challenge of building things, because it's easier to build things if you're thinking about from a government perspective. You can give money to build a thing rather than investing in a network and building human connections and things like this. And I think I think it's one of the things that we're going to be navigating over the next few years, is what this shock that we've been through means. But I think really the importance, is the relationships, and the question, particularly in the rural setting, is to what extent how we can best build and strengthen those networks, whether they are online or whether they are real. And I mean, this is something that we're looking at. We have a piece of research that we at the PEC are doing with the National Innovation Centre for the Rural Economy, where we're looking at rural microclusters and trying to figure out what's going on there, as well as some other work that we're doing looking at the Southwest, which is going to be going on, trying to understand some of these issues a bit more. And so I think hopefully this is an area where we will be able to have some more insights coming out, hopefully fairly soon.
But Josh, if you were going to, you got to the front of the queue to speak to a very senior policymaker, what would you ask them? What would be your recommendation from what you know to really, put some rocket fuel under creative industry companies and dispersed?
I think from my perspective, I think one of the really big things is access to finance. Access to other resources as well to allow companies to grow. And we know there's untapped demand, or we know there's demand that's untapped. And we know there's also people who are thinking about finance, but for various reasons are not applying, and trying to get people across the board to seek finance and to prepare financial institutions to be able to support these businesses. This seems like, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's shooting at an open goal, but it's something where we know there's demand, and we know that there are markets that could take this finance, and if there's appropriate support, I think this is something which is a way of unlocking some of the potential of rural creative businesses. Thanks,
Josh. And what about you, Karen? What would you say? What would be your number one ask?
It would be the finance thing as well. I have to agree with Josh, but also connectivity. If, as he says, the importance is the people and the networking and the community, then we need to make sure that we can facilitate that, whether it is virtual or whether it is real. So one of our brands that we work with on Hebrides, we have real difficulties sometimes. We're all there on the 5G, Teams meeting.
We need it now.
Yeah.
What about you, Emily?
I suppose to dig deeper. I think often with research within the rural economy, it's quite sort of, a lot of it's kind of observing what's there and not necessarily noticing what's happening underneath, below the surface. So I think to invest in digging a bit deeper to be able to uncover what's actually going on.
Brilliant, thank you. We do have one question that I managed to pick up on the last, which is from Brian Waterfield, who's a colleague in Falmouth, runs Immersive business there, and he wants to know about your pros and cons about your mobile. But maybe I think he's here, so I might be able to hook you up together to talk about that, because I think about doing the same thing.
Okay, yeah.
So
come find me.
So thank you so much, both of you, Karen, Emily, and thank you, Josh, for joining us from Surrey.
Thank you.